Hello, thanks for joining me. Today is part 3 in our series on understanding the characteristics and behavior of light as photographers and videographers. In part 1, we discussed the brightness of light source, or what we call the luminosity of a light source, understanding how we describe it, how we quantify it, and how we really discuss it as photographers. In part 2, we talked about something called specularity. Now, specularity is the transition from lit to unlit areas on the face, how quickly that happens, and how much of a bifurcating line there is from the lit to the unlit area in the face, and how we control that. But as we discussed specularity, we did not in any way discuss how much change we were dealing with. In other words, we didn't describe how much difference there was from the lit to the unlit area, or how deep the shadow was. In other words, we weren't talking about light contrast, which is the difference in relative values of light within the frame. That is our discussion for today. How do we understand light contrast? And not only that, how do we work with it and think about it and deal with it? So, light contrast is an understanding of the relative values of light within the frame. And we describe this in terms of aperture. One part of the frame we might say is in f4, another part of the frame is in f8. We discussed the way and why we talk about light in terms of aperture in the first video. Now, I want to give you an example to work with as we get underway here, and that is of a traditional landscape scene. We have some sky, we have some grass, we have some trees, and under the trees there's some shade. In other words, I have highlight, midtone, and shadow. If I expose for the grass, it's properly exposed, therefore it is midtone. The sky would then be brighter than the grass, so it's a highlight, and the shadow underneath the tree would of course be a shadow. Now, I have aperture and shutter and ISO to work with, and if I was to change any of those factors, I could change what area of the frame I'm exposing for. That would be just moving my midpoint. I could of course expose for the sky if I wanted to, and at that point I'm going to have a well-exposed sky and very underexposed rest of the frame. If I was to expose for the shadows, I would have the opposite. I would have a well-exposed area underneath the trees, and everything else would be too bright. The key for what I want you to take away here is that independent of how I move aperture, shutter, or ISO, the relative differences in brightness within the frame remain constant. All I'm doing is adapting to them. The majority of photography takes place in a realm where we adapt to light, and that's it. So the most technically accurate photographers are those who adapt the best. Now, if I wanted to talk about HDR photography, this would be a good way to jump in and say we could shoot multiple frames, merge them together, and expand our midpoint. That's high dynamic range photography. And that's not the purview of what we're talking about here today. Instead, I want to talk about how if we were to light part of that frame, what we'd be doing effectively is reducing the light contrast. But first, a little bit about terms. So you'll hear me describe light sources in terms of light contrast. It would also be accurate to describe this in terms of something called dynamic range. And the reason I avoid doing so is that we do discuss sensors in terms of dynamic range. As an example, we might say that the sensor in your camera has 12 stops of dynamic range. But if I was to put you into an environment with 15 stops of dynamic range among the sky and the grass and the shade underneath the tree, there is no exposure, no single exposure that you could select where you would not lose information either in highlights or in shadows. It would be mathematically impossible. So landscape photographers have been doing HDR for a number of years where they shoot multiple images and merge them. And we're not talking about landscape photography today. We're really talking about portraiture and lighting. And I bring up that example just to make sure I iterate the point that we walk into an ambient light condition, and until we light something artificially, we are adapting to the light contrast within the frame. But once I start lighting, I can be really creatively powerful at that point. And I can expand or I can reduce the light contrast in the frame, and I'll give you an example of both. Let's say I'm shooting a portrait outside at sunset. Now, I don't want my subject to be looking into the sun. I also want that beautiful sunset behind the subject, so I put the subject's back to the sunset. This puts my subject into shade. So if my background is f16 and the shadow on my subject's face gives an exposure there of f4 or f5.6, I'm several stops underexposed. The only way to get both the background and the subject lit properly is to light the subject artificially. And this is why I say that outdoor portraiture requires studio lighting, flash or strobe, in order to get consistent and quality results. So if I'm outside and I'm lighting the subject, what I'm doing is making the light on the face closer to f16. If I was to make the light on the face f22, then that would actually underexpose the background. More on that in a second. But if I was to just make the light on the face f16, then there is no light contrast effectively from the subject to the background. They are both f16 and they both look properly exposed. Therefore, I have reduced the light contrast within the frame. On the other hand, let's say that I was shooting a flower outside and I wanted to really make some dramatic impact in the shot. I wanted a very dark background. One thing I could do would be to light the subject with the flash really close and have a ton of light on the subject, f22, f29. If I did that, then the background, which may have been f8, is going to get darker and darker and darker and darker until the point when pretty much it turns nearly totally black, or at least looks like nighttime. What I'm doing is expanding the dynamic range by lighting my subject dramatically more than my background. This is done for real drama purposes. Now, if the background gets significantly darker than the subject, you'll reach a point when the background light just vanishes. It's just not strong enough to be in the exposure. We call this killing the ambient light. And it is something that we do in interior studio lighting shots. We do this so that we get complete control over the exposure in the frame. And that's a really powerful way of gaining creative control. So I want you to notice that I'm lighting a subject and controlling the light on that subject separately from the background. Now this goes against the way that we've thought about light whenever we were shooting just ambient light conditions in landscapes before. And I think that our teaching tool is incorrect here. So let me give you one that I like a little bit better. So we've been taught that we have shutter speed and aperture and ISO, and that's how we control exposure. We've been calling that the exposure triangle. I don't think that that is a good way of describing it. In fact, that exposure triangle did not help us when we lit the flower, when we lit the subject outside, or we lit a portrait inside. That exposure triangle only helped us with the ambient exposure. So this should really be called the ambient exposure triangle. The ambient exposure triangle is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. It's the three things we move to control for ambient light, which is a light source we do not control. We're adapting to it. What if I'm lighting my subject? Well, at that point, I have a whole new triangle. A new triangle of exposure factors that control the subject lit by strobing equipment. And this is going to be the ISO, the aperture, and the flash output. The flash gets brighter, light on the subject is brighter. Flash gets dimmer, light on the subject is dimmer. Please notice that with these two, if I change shutter speed, I will change background, but not subject. If I change flash output, I will change the subject, but not the background. And that's how I can control those two exposure triangles separately and thus control light contrast. If I have a situation where I have a lit subject and one side of the face is dimmer than the other because of the inverse square law, I could always add a light and fill that in. In this case, we actually describe those two lights in terms of a ratio, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 1.5, where the first one is always going to be a set number, and then we run off of that. So we control light on the subject and light contrast within the frame better when we light our subjects. We can, outdoors especially, but inside as well, we can control the light and reduce the light contrast. Something I particularly like doing is shooting people next to a window, lighting them from inside, and getting both a nice indoor and outdoor look. We can reduce light contrast, or we can create more and more light contrast for drama, but at a certain point, the ambient light will die in the frame, and at that point, you control the exposure entirely. If you want a lit background, you need to light it. If you want to have light on the other side of the face, you need to light it. If you want more drama, just don't light it. That becomes your prerogative. And that's the reason why we like to kill ambient light inside of the studio. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this was helpful in understanding the way that we place and discuss lights within a studio lighting environment. We're going to be coming back in the next 2 weeks with 2 more videos about the characteristics of light. But we are finished up with the 3 characteristics that have to do with brightness and transition. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this. Take a look at some other videos on the page around here. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. I very much appreciate it. I hope that we're talking about stuff that you really want to talk about and learn. And if there's some concept in studio lighting you want me to get into and discuss, get in the comments and let me know. Have a nice day. Bye.